This Week in Virology, the podcast about viruses, the kind that make you sick. From Microbe TV, this is TWiV, This Week in Virology, episode 508, recorded on August 24th, 2018. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you are listening to the podcast all about viruses. Joining me today here in New York City, Dickson Despommier.
Vincent, how are you?
Our resident artist.
A resident artist.
Nice day, right?
It's a gorgeous day out there. It was one of the top 10 so far, I think.
I think it hasn't rained in 5 days.
Probably not. That's true.
Also joining us from southeastern Michigan, Kathy Spindler.
Hi, everybody. I just noticed that one of my weather apps has a completely new interface. But it's 75 to 78 degrees here, depending on the app, which is 24 Celsius. But I have to read you something that was in our newspaper. So there's a 70% chance that we'll have an El Nino this winter. And El Nino winters have a chance of being warmer and drier than normal in the Great Lakes region. Since winter is a love-hate thing in Michigan, 50% of you just got depressed at the thought of a wimpy winter, and 50% of you just got really excited.
Which side are you on?
I like the idea of the wimpy winter. So, yeah, less snow to walk through and shovel. So, yeah.
Also joining us from Austin, Texas, Rich Condit.
Hi, everybody. It's hot here. We have 96 degrees, which is 36 C, roughly. Sunny. We have a UV index of 10 out of 10. We're headed for 102 today, which is about 38 C, and we need rain.
Really
Well,
dry, huh?
And Texas needs rain.
That's right.
That's an old.
They're rioting in.
They're rioting in Africa.
La, 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 la.
28 C here in New York City.
Yeah.
Mild.
With low humidity. It's really nice.
We have a guest today for your listening pleasure. He is returning for the third time on TWiV. Please welcome. That means everyone has to applause, right? Please welcome Jens Kuhn. Hey, Jens.
Hey, everybody. Hi, everybody. It's very nice on my side. So we have enough rain here for the last, I don't know, for any other city.
Yes, you have.
Yeah, but today is beautiful. It's 28 C. We have blue sky, a few clouds.
Yeah.
And it's actually not killing hot either. So it's nice to go outside for the first time in weeks.
So wait a minute. You're in Bethesda?
In Frederick, yeah, close.
In Frederick.
Yeah, they're close.
Remind us where you are, Jens.
I'm at the Integrated Research Facility at Fort Detrick in Frederick, Maryland.
Okay. Which is part of the NIAID, right?
Yeah, that's part of NIAID and part of NIH.
And part of that integrated, well, does that mean BSL-4 itself, or is there more than a BSL-4, the IRF?
Well, the IRF is pretty much a BSL-4 institute. I mean, of course, we have BSL-2 support and all these other things, but the operations are
right.
Pretty much BSL-4.
So, Jens, your first TWiV was 283. We talked about Ebola viruses. And then 357, we talked about taxonomy.
Yep.
And today, this is your idea, and it's a great idea. We're going to talk a little bit about bioweapons and biodefense and biocrimes, etc. And you had a great idea to pick up. So you have 2 PhDs and a master's degree, right? And an MD. Yep. Oh my gosh.
And an MD. Yep.
Explain the 2 PhDs. I'm a little confused.
He did that last.
Is one in art history?
Close. One in medical history.
Oh, right.
Science.
No. Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
right. Mm-hmm.
So I have another question about what you do. Who pays you?
Oh, okay. This is a very good lead in for my disclaimers, right? So I am an employee of Battelle. So I'm a contractor. I work at NIH, not for NIH.
Battelle is a contract research organization, correct?
it's a non-profit organization that
Right.
has multiple arms and multiple yes. So and that means that I just need to say right from the start that I don't speak for Battelle, I don't speak for NIH, and I don't speak for any other organization that I might mention during this entire talk.
Okay.
Speak for Jens Kuhn, right?
That's right. That's right. Blame me for any inaccuracy and any nonsense that I say.
So am I right in assuming that like NIH pays Battelle and Battelle pays you? Is that reasonable?
Yes. That's
Okay.
reasonable. I'm sure I'm going to get corrected in the end. But
Battelle's main office is in Seattle?
Battelle's main office is in Columbus, Ohio.
Columbus,
Yep.
Ohio.
Interesting. I'm
Well,
familiar with them
West-
because I had a friend who was an administrator, worked out at the Hanford Labs in
Right.
where's that? Richland, Washington, where they
that's
did a
what
lot of
I thought that's where
uranium enrichment during the war, and Battelle runs that national lab and several others, I think.
Yeah, Battelle is very big. It's doing a lot of things on military contracts, and I think they just got the Los Alamos contract as well.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
So the last time we talked about your education and so forth, but now pick up where you left Germany to do a master's at US AMRIT, okay, and then how that led you to the Soviet bioweapons facilities.
Okay. Well, I wanted to do a master's thesis in some laboratory where I could at least get in touch someone with Ebola virus. That was always my interest. And so in the end, I, through very meandering ways, found my way to the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases for doing my master's thesis. That institute is right next door to where I sit right now. So we are on the same campus called the National Interagency Biodefense Campus. We have 3 institutes. So the IRF, where I work, which is a NIAID institute, NBAC, which is the Department of Homeland Security Institute, and then USAMRIT, the Army Institute by DoD next door. So we're all adjacent to each other. So I went there in 1998, I think, for my master's thesis. I'm getting old, slowly too. So
We all are.
yeah, time passes quickly. And I worked there on trying to develop a vaccine against Ebola virus. And of course, we all know how that went not well because, right now we have a VSV candidate and stuff, but whatever I did was not very useful at the time. But I, like every master student, needed to write, introductions and stuff for the thesis. And so I have a little bit of an OCD German mind, and I wanted to know more about Ebola. And so I started delving into the literature and wanted to write a really good introduction. And that became bigger and bigger and more complicated. And after a while, it was not really the introduction for the thesis anymore. After a while, I thought, could be an article, could be a book chapter. And in the end, it turned out to be a filovirus book, which I published. And I think we talked about this last time. And during writing this book, I came across a lot of, interesting problems that I honestly never really thought about when I started all of this. So, and USAMRIT, of course, is an Army Institute, and as an Army Institute, it has Army interests. And I had nothing to do with the Army ever before. So in Germany, we had a compulsory military service. But there was a way to get out of this by taking civic service instead, and that's what I did. So I've never been in the Army, and so like words like theater and warrior and all of these things were completely unknown to me.
Strategic and tactical weapons. That's always bothered me. Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot of these phrases, and so I didn't know anything about this. I also didn't honestly care that much. I mean, if you look at these institutes, they're research institutes, and of course, USAMRIT is run by the Army, and they have a commander, and they have soldiers in the building, and soldier scientists, and so on. But also, they have a very sizable civilian force that work in the laboratories, and who do not wear uniforms, and you don't see much saluting, and all of these things on the entire campus. So it overall looks like a research campus, and it felt like regular research. But through being there, of course, I was exposed to debates about regulations for viruses and who can work with them and who cannot. So today we call them select agents. At the time, I think they were called restricted agents, or they got a little asterisk in the predecessors of the BMBL and all of this. And so I started just like being curious a little bit about who's working with these things and why are they working on them. So, I mean, now today we're so used to having BSL-4 facilities all over the place and new ones being built. But at that time, there were really only 2 facilities in the United States that focused on BSL-4 agents, and that was USAMRIID and then CDC in Atlanta. Yeah, and so that was the first time that I heard anything about like biodefense and offensive versus defensive measures and bad actors and good actors and so on. And the moment you get into that realm, everything becomes wonderfully complicated and wonderfully gray. And so I enjoy gray zones. I'm not a big fan of black and white. I don't think it ever applies to any problem. But the moment you get into biodefense, you're knee deep in policy and politics and interpretations and misinterpretations and so on. And so I became intrigued through that. So to write that filovirus book or that thesis introduction, I started contacting people all over the world to get research articles on Ebola virus that I could not get in the local library. And I think we talked about this a little bit in one of the previous TWiVs. And there's a lot of literature out there on especially exotic agents that you simply will not be aware of if you just look into PubMed or Web of Science or the common databases, let alone will you actually get it if you have found it. And so I started writing, people in Africa and people in France, whether I can get this or the other publication from 1975 in some journal that nobody has ever heard of. And among them were a lot of Russian papers. And I was told at the time that I can completely forget getting these Russian papers because, the Russians, as they're typically referred to at that time, the Russians won't play ball and they will not share their stuff, and everything is secret and classified because they're doing offensive things with Ebola virus and so on. And so I was naive. I was a student, and so I just wrote letters and said, "Can you please send me something? Can you please send me something?" And it turned out actually that many of the Russian colleagues in the end were very eager to share their research, and it wasn't that what they shared with me wasn't classified at all. There was stuff out there, and they wanted to see these things cited and discussed like any other scientist. And so I got these boxes full of papers in Russian, which I couldn't read. And started looking into this, what all of this means. And so ultimately, I think this got me into biodefense, right? Because if somebody says somewhere there's an offensive program and everything is highly secretive, you are like at least 3 toes in a conspiracy theory. So first it means I don't get any articles because everything is secret, and then if I get articles, well then of course these articles must be lies, and so it mushrooms very quickly to like no matter which kind of information you provide, there will be a counter argument that this is also not right.
So all the genes that they talked about were pseudogenes?
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, I finished my master's thesis. So at Fort Detrick, went back to Germany and traveled back and forth a little while between different places, did rotations and so on. And I was in school at the same time in medical school, so everything was overlapping with me. So I was all over the place. And then I was home in Germany, and I think I stayed with my mom for that time. And I heard that a new BSL-4 laboratory would open in Sweden and Stockholm at the Karolinska Institute. And because I was interested in returning to the BSL-4 area in some way, I thought, maybe if I go to this conference, I can make some contacts and find some person who would take me low life as a postdoc or something, and all of this. So I went. I went by train and ferry and so on to Stockholm, and went to this conference. And that conference had a tour of the local BSL-4, but you could only go into the BSL-4 in groups of, I forgot how many, 5 or 10 people or something like that at a time. So there's a long line of people who all wanted to see this very modern facility. And I was standing there for a very long time until it was my turn. And there was somebody standing behind me that I started to chat with. So he asked me, where are you from and what do you do and what you're interested in. And it was a very normal conversation. And I mentioned that I had already worked in several countries and in many different labs, and that I'm interested in languages and cultures and so on and so on. And in the end, that person just said like, wow, I mean, the only thing that's missing on your list is basically Russia. And I said, like, oh, sure. I mean, if I find somebody who pays me to go to Russia, I'll go to Russia. And he said, really? And I was like, yeah. And in the evening, I got an offer to go to Russia. So
who was this guy? Who was this person anyway? Was he?
It was a person. Let's take the names out of it, because I'm not really sure whether the people are comfortable with having their names necessarily all over the podcast. Okay. But it was a DoD employee.
Okay.
For the US.
Mm-hmm.
And also in the end very involved in a lot of different non-proliferation activities. And so I said, like, yeah, what would this be and what would I do? And so the first information that I got basically was there was a need for somebody who was sent through the States into a Russian laboratory that was Biowarfare, a bioweapons facility until a few years ago. And the idea was simply to start an open research project at that facility. And so I knew nothing about any of this at the time. So I just said, this sounds kind of cool. Where in Russia? And they would say, well, it's in Siberia. And I said, Siberia. And so the only thing I know about Siberia is, gulags and lots of snow. I had no idea. I was completely stupid at the time.
Huge area.
Yeah, I know. I mean, just with many things, I was just completely blind. But I said, okay, fine. I've never been to Siberia, so why not? And it was. It sounded interesting, right? It sounded. I needed another rotation for my biochem program, and there was an option to do a project in a lab in a different country I haven't been in, and I did this before with other places in regular labs, and I said, well, why not? So I agreed to that, and then over the next month, I learned a little bit more of what all of this is really about, and so, but that's complicated. So we probably need to start from the beginning somewhere.
So you ended up going to Siberia, and you went to Vector, right? Or Biopreparat. Yeah. So can you kind of give us an overview of the Soviet bioweapons? I mean, it was huge. You sent us a bunch of
this is an Oblinsk
papers and we'll put all these in the show notes, but they are wonderful descriptions on the massive Soviet bioweapons program. And we can't cover it all here, but it's obviously was the biggest. Many countries did bioweapons, right? But the Soviet program was the biggest.
So I'd be interested in setting the stage here with a very brief history of bioweapons. I mean, it goes way back, but then and actually one of these it's the Army's thing has a sort of ancient history of bioweapons that's really interesting. But at any rate,
yeah, a great art. That's a great book, by the way.
So it really is a good book. And but then sort of what you might call modern bioweapons, everybody was participating, right? Up until like the 70s, 72 or something was the first agreement to stop bioweapons, right?
Yeah.
And until then, all the Western democracies were participating.
Right. So let's start from the beginning with all of this. So so the reason why I wanted to come on TWiV when I first started talking with Vincent about all of this was that I hear these phrases like, bioweapons or biodefense used very laxly on TWiV and in other places. And often people say, like, Bacillus anthracis is a bioweapon. And of course, it's not a bioweapon. Bacillus anthracis is a bacillus. But of course, you can use it in some nefarious way in the form of a weapon. And it starts with the whole definition thing. So I'm a stickler for definitions and standardizations and everything else. And it has always bothered me that there's actually no real definition of what a bioweapon is. There's a UN definition, but that is not being accepted by NATO. There's a NATO definition, but that is not accepted by other organizations and so on. But overall, the idea of a bioweapon is that it is some kind of a dispersal device that has some kind of ammunition, which is typically a formulated pathogen. Formulated means you need to do more than just grow it, right? You need to code it. You need to make sure that it survives the dispersal in some kind of a way, that it floats in the air, and all of these other different things. So it's a very complex, difficult thing to do. So when I say the word bioweapon, I mean that, right? I mean a technologically sophisticated dispersal device, not just a culture of some mean bacterium that was grown somewhere in a laboratory.
So the word weaponized comes in here too, right?
Right.
Because Bacillus anthracis, I agree, that's just a bacteria. But to make it survivable under these conditions is weaponization?
Yeah, weaponization is, I don't know, I get emails here, I need to figure out how to turn this off. Weaponization typically, I need to mention also from the very beginning, so I am a virologist by training and I'm an MD and everything else. I'm not an arms control specialist, right? And so I know, I think, a little bit more about all of these things than many other virologists around me, but at the same time, I know nothing in comparison to the people who actually do this on a daily basis, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of interpretation on my side too, and so you need to take everything with a little bit of a grain of salt. So weaponization, as far as I understand, is ultimately the deployment of a weapon, so that you have a device ready at the end that you could actually deploy in a conflict or in a nefarious way, in some way, to disperse something and cause harm. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't mean that you grow a maxi prep of a mean bacterium and now you have weaponized it. Typically, the next step is you need to purify it, you need to coat it, you need to make it, you need to be able to store it in some kind of a way, right? I mean, typically, especially if you look at bioweapons programs for warfare. The ideal weapon would be somewhere stored in a bunker until you need it, and then you can fill it very quickly into some kind of a bomblet or something, and then you can put that bomblet on some kind of a plane, and then you can deploy it somewhere and actually release it, and then will actually cause the disease that you wanted to cause with the effect that you wanted, and all of this other stuff.
So wait a second, because when you use the word bomblet, both in reading, in the writing, and what you just said, how is a bomblet different from a bomb?
It's much smaller.
Smaller, yeah. So if you look at the few biological weapons devices that we know something about, and this is the other problem in this entire discussion, right? Everything is super secret. I mean, no program wanted to have anybody know anything about their programs because, of course, they were military programs. And so we have very little information about most of the modern programs. So you can go back to declassified documents from the US program and the UK program, and you can see what has been done there. There are some pictures of early Soviet bioweapons. So these look like bombs, but when you open them up, they are filled with bomblets, with little balls, metal balls that contain the individual agent. And then you would drop the actual bomb, and then the bomb would open, and then all these little balls would fly out, and through the air and through the falling, they would start rotating, and then slowly start dispersing the stuff that is in them.
I see. So it's not just shrapnel. It's
not just a letter addressed to a senator with white powder inside of it.
No, correct.
That's a terrorist act, but it's not a weaponized thing, right?
It's not a bomb.
But if you take but if you take the definition of a dispersal device, you could probably argue that a letter filled with powder that starts dusting up when you open it is a dispersal device, although a very crude one, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So. Where were we? I lost my train of thought.
Start at the beginning.
Oh yeah, right. Start at the beginning. So, so if you go all the way back hundreds of years and stuff, then a biological weapon was simply poison, right? So you can go all the way back to Brahmin war codes and stuff where it was mentioned that it's unhonorable to have to use poisoned darts in warfare. It said it's not a decent thing to do, and that's actually a very interesting, from an ethical point of view, a very interesting theme throughout the biowarfare and bioweapons debate. Bioweapons have always been considered immoral compared to other weapons, which is, for me, always confusing. I mean, I'm not really sure what is better or worse about a nuclear bomb.
There are moral ways to kill people and immoral ways to kill people.
Right.
Go figure.
But if you think about this, we had this kind of idea that there's different qualities of warfare for a very long time, right? So it's like you don't attack, you're not supposed to attack children and women in war. They're very strong ethical codes for many hundreds of years that you don't do this. Or even civilians often were spared in particular warfares between particular nations. And then, of course, these codes differ from attacker to attacker or attacked to the attacked.
The United States is terrible at that, though, with regards to their attitude towards Native Americans. That's how they conquered most of them. They killed women and children.
Right, and so there's a lot of these things when you then think about variola virus laden blankets giving to Native Americans and so on, which of course is a form of biowarfare. It's an introduction of an agent to do something. But it's if you go through this history, the most interesting thing for me was that Hitler was against biological weapons because he found them immoral. And that is stunning to me.
But
right?
Stalin approved them, I'm sure.
Right, and so as far as we know, Germany had a biological weapons program right before and during the First World War, and that was, as far as I remember, mainly targeted against horses. So horses of the opposing nations.
What about gas?
The army.
What about gas and all the Jews? That's a biological weapon.
But gas is chemical.
It's a poison.
Not a biological weapon.
Yeah, he wasn't against that.
Okay. No, he was not against that. So it is. I read a few books from a few German scholars, and they tried to explain this opposition of Hitler towards biological weapons with his experience of being attacked with chemical weapons while he was at the front in the First World War, and that he was so shocked at the insidious ways of being attacked by something invisible that he cannot defend against, or something that I don't know. I mean, this is a weird discussion because I certainly can't explain Hitler. But it is weird that a lot of people somehow think that bacteria really mean evil way to kill you, whereas all the other ways seem to be more okayish. I'm very suspicious of any weapon. So in the beginning, they with poisons at that time, when it was several hundred years ago, with poisons they meant things like frog poisons and flower poisons and what venoms, what we would call them today, or toxins, what we would call them today, that would be laced on a stick that you would get stuck with, and then while the stick is not killing you, you would get some effect of the toxin of the bacteria that are on there and so on. But of course, at that time they had absolutely no idea what they were smearing on there. And then this developed a little further, I think at the end of the 1800s with the Hague protocols that had wording in there that anything with anything poisoned and toxined and biological will be evil. And that ultimately evolved into the 1925 Geneva Convention that prohibited the deployment, the use of biological weapons, but not the storage or the development. And then nothing happened. Well, I mean, policy people will kill me for saying this, but it was very quiet on the convention front for a very long time until 1972, when the Biological Toxin and Weapons Convention got into effect, and that is currently the norm against the development of biological weapons and their use and their storage and so on for the majority of nations in the world.
So between 1925, where there was the Geneva Protocol, and 1972, despite the prohibition of German chemical warfare in the Geneva Protocol in 1925, quite a few nations, including the U.S., were involved in the research and development of biological weapons, right? Up until 1972. Is that correct?
Right. So not that I want to defend any biological weapons development, but the 1925 Geneva Convention did not prohibit the research or the production or the storage.
Okay.
It just prohibited the use.
Okay.
And so that ultimately opened the doors for a lot of different nations to actually have programs and to look into all of this stuff and to do research. And so the biggest players at that time, the US had a big program, the US, the UK, and Canada, and of course France had a program, and a bunch of other countries had programs, and of course Russia had so Soviet Union at the time had a program. And this was, I would say, I would call this the second phase of biological weapons development. So the first one was, we know something is poisonous and weird and we're going to use this, but we don't really understand what's behind it. Then the second phase was, now we know Bacillus anthracis causes anthrax and Burkholderia malii causes glanders. And so therefore there's a list of things that were thought to be useful for weapons development. And so the programs focused on that. But it was classical microbio in a way, right? So it was, somebody found a strain of something somewhere, they grew it, and then they tried to formulate it, put it in some kind of a dispersal device, and that would be the weapon. But there was no manipulation of the agent or what we would do today, right, where you say like a characterization of sequences and selections and I don't know what. So none of that was there. And that's also why viruses were not really a huge part of these early programs until the 70s, because we knew very little about viruses, and there were very few growth protocols that allowed you to grow half a ton of virus X. Mm-hmm. So it was very complicated to do, and of course you needed cell culture, and cell culture was not very developed either, and especially not for bite production. So there were a few viruses that people were interested in. So the US program looked a little bit into yellow fever and into Rift. Venezuelan equine encephalitis virus was pretty much a component of every biowarfare program at the time, but it was not a major component. I mean, the main focus of all these programs were typically Bacillus anthracis and Yersinia pestis, Burkholderia malii, Burkholderia pseudomallii, those kind of bugs. And then in 1969, the U.S. renounced bioweapons development and research and use and everything together unilaterally. They came forward and said, we're not going to do this stuff anymore. This is not right, for many different reasons, also political reasons. But they said, okay, let's stop this. And so until this time, the base that I'm on was known as Fort Detrick, Camp Detrick, I think it was called. And this was an offensive military site that civilians had no access to, and it was an army base that was closed to the public. And from that very moment on, it was transformed into what it is today, and a very open, very transparent defense site that you can visit, and you can visit all the labs, and you can. There's some hoops that you have to jump through and stuff, but it's not a super secret site anymore. And from that very moment on, the U.S. became biodefense only. And so biodefense is, defensive, not offensive. And there starts an interesting discussion of what is what and how do you define all this. Right. And then through this unilateral move, the 1972 Bioweapons Convention came about, that ultimately put the kibosh on bioweapons globally. And a lot of nations ultimately signed and ratified this, among others, the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union said, we're not going to do this anymore. And while they were signing this treaty, they expanded their classical BW program into a modern BW program, which should ultimately evolve to become the biggest bioweapons program in the world.
So just to insert, when you say BW, it's bioweapons.
Bioweapons, yeah.
Decoding the abbreviation.
Right.
Yes, you're right.
So when they say yes, they mean no? And the other way around?
Right. So ultimately, the Soviet Union was really in violation of that treaty. So you can say this was an illicit bioweapons program that they maintained until the end of until 1990 about.
I'd like to just say something here too, because in my early days as a graduate student, I was associated with a virology laboratory. Morris Pollard ran this laboratory at the University of Notre Dame, and there were like 10 virology students. And one of them was in the military. His name was Jerry Eddy. I don't know if you knew that guy or not. He was elevated to captain by the time the Vietnam War was coming to a close, because everybody was being killed off, and his rank just kept moving up, and he did nothing except just go to school, and he moved from a lieutenant all the way up to captain simply by attrition. He got involved in working with Lassa virus, because in 1969 it was discovered by John Frame, and I think that was one of our first TWiVs ever. Mm-hmm. And I actually had the privilege, I guess you could call it that, of introducing Jerry Eddy to John Frame, who was then charged with the Army of going over to Africa and collecting immune serum from people who had recovered from Lassa and then giving it to the laboratory at Fort Detrick.
Mm. Cool.
Yeah.
So Jens, you went then as you described earlier, to a facility that had been closed, right? A Soviet facility?
Yeah, so
right.
So 1972 is the Bioweapons Convention. Everybody shuts down, and the Soviet Union is supposed to, but they don't.
They expand.
Right?
They expand.
They ramp up.
Mm-hmm. But then at some point, their program ends. And when's that and why?
So the program ended, so it's depending on who you talk to. So the program ended somewhere between 1989 and 1993.
So basically that's with the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
Right. So the American intelligence system, as far as I understand, really didn't have the Soviet bioweapons program on their radar screen in any kind of way. So there were every now and then some people would bring up that like the Soviets would do something mean and evil, but there was really no proof for a very long time until the Sverdlovsk incident. I don't know which year this was, but I think you guys talked about this a few times. When there was an accident in the town of Sverdlovsk, which is now Yekaterinburg, I think, where anthrax spores were released from a bioweapons facility and killed a whole bunch of people. And the epidemiology of this, and that so many people got anthrax, although there was no contaminated meat anywhere to be seen, and they made a lot of people very suspicious that something fishy was going on. And so there was a little bit of a blip on the radar screen that the Soviet Union might be doing something bad. But as far as I know, still no real, what do you call, counterintelligence, or like that somebody would actually have an eye on it. It really became only visible to the US and probably UK and allies that the Soviet Union had this big program because of defectors. And so the first defector who really knew something about the program was Vladimir Pasechnik, who defected, I think, in 88 or 89.
October 89.
Yeah, October 89. And basically told U.S. or U.K. Officials about a program that he's involved in his institute, which I think was somewhere in Moscow, that there was a secret bioweapons program. And then there were other defectors coming around, plus minus 2 years, from different corners, until Kanatjan Alibekov, Ken Alibek, defected, and he was the deputy director of Biopreparat, which is a huge branch of that Soviet biological weapons program. And at that very moment, it became clear that this program was not, some garage operations of some tiny little military arm, but this was a huge organization that involved thousands of people, maybe even tens of thousands of people, and massive financial aid. And it was kept super, super secret. And it looked into anything from weapons against humans, against plants, against livestock, against toxins, non-toxins for strategic use, for tactical use, for everything. So and because the Soviet Union was crumbling apart, there was a window of opportunity, I would call it, to put an end to this, because you could put pressure on the disintegrating nation and saying we will only help, or we will only do X, Y, and Z with you if you stop that program. And the first step, of course, was that somebody actually had to admit that this program existed. And so Yeltsin finally admitted that, and then rescinded it later. But he admitted to the program. And after this admission was out, there was an official termination. And then it took at least 2 or 3 years after that, where Yeltsin admitted that he actually did not have the power to really stop the program, although he ordered it to be stopped, because the military itself continued doing things. So that's why I said 1989 to 1993 or something like this of when it really ended. And then, of course, there's the overall problem that if you have a nation that cheated on you for 20 years with a massive program that involves 10,000 scientists and so on, what kind of measures are in place now to make us believe that now it's actually stopped.
So
that's when your visit comes in, among other things.
Right.
What role did the KGB play in all this? Because they're not military, are they? They're sort of a separate intelligence branch of the Soviet Union. So Putin must have been involved in this in the early days.
Yeah,
how do you make the military do what you want it to do? And I think that's done through the KGB, not through Yeltsin.
Yeah, so I wish actually I had so we wrote a book on the I didn't write this at all. Milton Leitenberg and Raymond Zelinskas wrote a book on the Soviet biological weapons program. It's a huge tome of some 800-900 pages, and I think so far this is the authoritative thing of what we know about this program. And I was lucky enough because I knew Milton for quite some time and also Ray to get involved with this. So that's why the book says by Milton and Ray with Jens Kuhn. I really. I didn't write this. I was just a technical advisor and tried to get, the virology and bacteriology straight in some way. But when we looked into all of these organizational charts and everything else, my summary of all of this is in the Soviet Union, everything was military.
Okay.
So if you look at the flow chart of the Soviet biological weapons program, the Ministry of the Defense, and at that time it was called the 15th Directorate, they really steered it all. And so under that 15th Directorate, there were like 4 or 5 branches. So one was called GLAV Microbioprom. That was officially the biological industrial complex. So the things that produce yogurt and or antibiotics and so on. And so it's a huge complex. And under GLAV Microbioprom, there was Biopreparat. And Biopreparat was this semi-secret what they would call the civilian arm of bioweapons development. And civilian in the sense that this was not visible to the outside, that this was steered by the military. So it was under civilian institutes with civilian researchers and so on. There would not be people in army fatigues running around. But the shots were called at the Ministry of Defense's 15th Directorate. And so Biopreparat itself had about 45 or so facilities, and some of them huge. And so one of them was the All Union Institute, the old Vector, what is today called the Scientific Research Institute of Molecular and Biology, Vector in Novosibirsk in Siberia, where I went to, had a previous name. So these are facilities that had like 4,000, 5,000 employees at their heydays. Another one was the facility in Obolensk, I think the All Union Institute for Applied Microbiology was really called. That was the sister facility to that focused on bacteria. And then there were facilities all over the place. And that's just one branch. But then there's the Ministry of Agriculture. And the Ministry of Agriculture had several facilities that focused on bioweapons development against livestock and crops. That was also, so the Ministry of Agriculture's program was under the Ministry of Defense. And then there was the anti-plague system under the Ministry of Health, which was also steered by the Ministry of Defense. And the anti-plague system is actually a very famous system that started in Imperial Russia with the old Pasteur Institutes that basically just looked at introduction of infectious diseases over the borders into the nation with ships and cavalry and I don't know what. And it's a huge system that has institutes and individual stations and has an outbreak response team and everything else. But within this public health system, they had a program that looked into bioweapons. And then there were the actual military institutes, which of course were under the Ministry of Defense. And so the big institutes in Kirov, in Zagorsk, which is now Sergiev Posad, in Sverdlovsk, where that accident happened, at the military medical academies and on all of those places. And somewhere in this mesh was the KGB.
Right.
So your visit was under the auspices. This is 1998, right?
My visit or the end of this? Yeah. So,
yeah.
So
your visit was around 1998, right?
My visit was in 2001.
Oh, your visit was in 2001. Right. Okay. So by then, ostensibly, this program had been dismantled, correct?
Let's call it stopped. right?
Okay.
So this dismantled. So dismantled means that, like, facilities that were specifically built for, let's say, filling bombs or putting bombs into planes or whatever it is, were actually destroyed. And so some facilities were actually destroyed. So the huge plant in Stepnogorsk in Kazakhstan, where many weapons were tested in huge explosion chambers and so on, that was actually destroyed with the help of the US and other nations, I think. And so that was actually dismantled. But you cannot really say that the entire program was dismantled. I would say the intent was stopped, so the offensive part got out of it, and researchers were redirected and facilities were transformed.
Okay, so was your visit under the auspices of some organization that was trying to, assist in the redirection of the Russian effort, or what?
Yes. So when the program was stopped, let's make it 1993. At that very moment, a few very smart politicians in the US and in other countries realized that a huge problem comes about, which is, where do all these researchers with all their knowledge go when they suddenly don't have a job anymore in these secret companies?
You mean like rocket scientists?
Yeah, just like rocket scientists. That's right. So at the time, there were two senators, a Republican and Democrat, called Nunn and Lugar, that looked mainly into the possible proliferation of nuclear weapons, because they had the same problem, right? So the Soviet Union disintegrated. Suddenly you had tons of new nations, and you had nuclear weapons on the sovereign territory of novel nations who not necessarily needed them or knew what to do about them, or had the means to protect those sites, right? Because the Russian army, Soviet army, was suddenly a Russian army and was not there anymore to guard all of these places. Right. And because many of these things were also secretive, it wasn't even clear whether most of the nations even knew that they had these kind of weapons or these kind of institutes somewhere. So there was a big worry that the nukes could get loose, that somebody could steal them, or that somebody could detonate them, and also that physicists and engineers and so on that had a lot of knowledge in how to build these weapon systems could be recruited by countries considered enemies to the US and its allies. And so they started a program that was first called the Nunn-Lugar. I'm getting old. The Nunn-Lugar Act or something like this, and ultimately it morphed into a program called the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, CTR. And the idea here was, okay, we somehow need to support these new nations, and especially Russia, to ensure that these scientists stay put, that they find a new way in life, and that don't go to, Iran and sell their knowledge to a perceived hostile nation. So, and that was done. The idea behind that was basically, let's do some kind of a grant assistance program, and then let's have American contractors go to these sites and secure them. Let's make sure that, a barbed wire fence is built around them, and that we have cameras and all of this other stuff. And so this was a very interesting period of time, because there was, or these senators and the teams associated with them, managed to establish a lot of trust between nations that were for so long so hostile to each other, right? It takes an amount of trust to let a foreign nation have their military expert come to your base and install cameras and security and all these other things around something. So it's actually pretty astonishing from a political point of view.
But the United States government actually bought warheads from these countries to bring back to this country, and then use the uranium for an enrichment for the power plants here. We saved a huge amount of money this way.
Yeah, so, there were a bunch of different deals of dealing with this, because of course from the Russian side, the Russians also did not necessarily have an interest in their new neighbors having nuclear weapons, right? Yeah, so I'm not saying this was all done completely from the good heart of we don't like weapons, but it was
we love weapons. Come on, this country loves the weapons. Our country.
I'm not going to get into that. but it was a pretty interesting time where I would say the individual security interests, both national and international, of Russia and US and many allied countries and the European Union and Japan and so on somehow aligned. They all realized there was a problem. Mm-hmm. And the big problem were the nukes. That's something that everybody thinks about immediately. But within these discussions, the bioweapons started to come up as well. And of course, the problem is exactly the same, right? Sure. So there is this misconception among many scientists, surprisingly, that it is not difficult to build a biological weapon because if you need lots of stuff, you just grow lots of stuff. And of course, this is there's a reason why we have an entire industry trying to make yogurt and beer, and why these plants look super complicated, because you cannot scale up your mini and your maxi prep to a few hectoliters that easily. Right. So there's a lot of knowledge that you need to have in order to just grow large amounts of Agent X. Make sure that this Agent X, while you grow it to these large amounts, doesn't lose its virulence factors. Be able to purify clean stuff from huge amounts of slurry and so on. Then be able to coat this the right way that it would survive heat and pressure in, let's say, a missile. And the oxygen and the UV radiation when you disperse it in the air, and then actually make sure that it gets to the population, gets inhaled, and so on and so on. So there's tons of technological steps in there. And I would say it actually has been mastered by very, very few programs for very few agents, despite the fact that thousands of people were working in these programs and lots of money. So the people who were involved in this, of course, were very, very knowledgeable, but they were also in super secret programs. So they didn't really publish anything. They didn't really have a CV to show. So now the program is over. We don't do bioweapons anymore. Okay, now you need to find a job. Well, where are you going to apply? With what? I mean, you can't talk about what you did in the past at all. You go straight to jail or worse if you talk about it. So
publish and perish.
That's right, literally publish and perish. This was a huge issue. And so the easiest way, of course, people thought what people would do at that very moment is look around of where the expertise is needed and then get recruited by other nations to say, hey, we always wanted to have a bioweapons program, so why don't you come over to us and help us? And so that was recognized by Nunn and Luger and all the people that surrounded them in the CTR program. And so relatively quietly, not secretly, but just quietly, assistance programs were established to help the scientists in these institutes to make the transition from secret to public health, to give them a CV, to get them involved. And that's ultimately then where I came in. The idea, in the beginning, the idea was simply, all right, let's make money available to the institutes that are of the greatest concern to us. Basically like a grant program, right? So you have an idea for a project, you send it into the US or to the UK or any other country that was involved in these efforts. And if we like that project that you propose, we're going to give you the money, and then you're going to do that project. And the precondition, of course, would be that in that project that you propose, there's nothing offensive in there whatsoever, but you use your expertise to do something either defensive in nature or even better for public health. And so at Vector, the institute where I eventually went to, their expertise were Ebola virus, Marburg virus. They're the one of the two sites where they store variola virus, so the agent of smallpox. And they do all the other BSL-4 agents that you can think of, including CCHF, so Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, Hunter viruses, and so on. And the expertise that you need to, let's say, isolate them from their natural vectors, so let's say CCHF from ticks or Hunter viruses from rodents, to grow them, to characterize them, to diagnose them, or to develop medical countermeasures against them, like vaccines and everything else. I mean, all of those things are typical public health activities. So if you take the actual weapons development part out of it, those are the right people to do these kind of experiments. So there were several grant assistance institutions that were put in place. The biggest one and most influential one was probably the International Science and Technology Center in Moscow, which was an international organization to do exactly this for Russia and all the successor states, the newly independent states they were called at the time, NIS. And then there were other such institutes or organizations like CRDF here in the United States, or IPP, and certain Japanese organizations. The EU had huge programs, and they all basically tried. You could basically choose, if you were in this program in Russia, you could basically choose which organization you would go to, and you could write a project proposal. Then you would get funding, and you could do something. Let's call it fun, right? Something nice and good for the world. And so one of the things that I learned when I was over there and I met with many of the people who made use of these programs is that I would say the majority of scientists were incredibly happy that they got this opportunity, because most of them didn't want to develop weapons. Right. I mean, there were certainly a few very patriotic people who believe we need to save Mother Russia the same way how we have very patriotic people in the army in the U.S. And for them, weapons development is part of military and so on. And so, of course, they were fine with it. But the majority of people didn't want to do this. They went into these programs because they came with perks. So if you worked in any of these secretive facilities, your life was impacted one because you had to live in secret cities. So they were actually called secret cities, right? So there were places where even the perimeter of the actual settlement was highly guarded, and if anybody without permission would even come close with a car, they would get stopped and interrogated and everything else. And so you had to live within this place. You couldn't freely travel. You could certainly not leave the country and go to conferences and all of this other stuff. So there were downsides, but the upsides were that the salaries were much better than a regular researcher would get in a regular National Academy of Science institute somewhere, and they offered access to goods, to fruit, and other things that were not available on the local markets. And then, of course, as often with these institutes, it's a scientific El Dorado if you think about purely from what you can do scientifically, right, in terms of machinery and reagents and funding and all of these other things. So a lot of people got sucked into this. And through the research that Milton and Ray did for the Soviet Biowarfare book, we also learned that the way how these institutes were set up it was very difficult for researchers to actually figure out what they were working on. So it's not like you would imagine that like some KGB guy would approach you and say, hey, you want to work on weapons? And then you say yes, and then you're going to go into this institute, and then you will know that you're a bioweaponeer. But instead, these institutes had an administrative structure that we ultimately called an onion structure. Like the more you peel away, the more closer you get to what it really is. And so many people were simply recruited from the top universities, so the top graduates of their PhD programs, and so on, were simply recruited into these institutes and said, like, we're going to give you a lot of money if you work on virus X and stuff, and because we really want to develop, let's say, an ELISA system for the detection of this, you want to come over here, and if you come over here, you get this kind of salary, and you have this kind of stuff available. And of course, many people would say yes. They would consider it an honor that they would be approached by the government and that they would get all these perks and they would get into these institutes and they would start working exactly on what they were asked to do, develop diagnostic assays, for example. And so this was the most outer layer. So it was still a secret institute. Nobody could really get in there, and you were still not really allowed to talk about it. But at the same time, this was more under the umbrella of like you're doing something for the country. It was not, there was typically no military ever to be seen somewhere. So it looked basically legit. And then while people were working at these institutes, people placed within the institutes looked out for those people that they thought could be trusted a step more or like had the skills to be useful for the next layer, and they would be recruited into the official biodefense system. And there they would be told, that the US and other nations are developing biological weapons and they might attack us one day. And so what we really need is good diagnostic systems and good counter vaccines. And so therefore we need to do animal experiments to like see whether we can defend against all of this. And then they would recruit them in there. And so now we have, two people who will work exactly on the same problem next to each other at the bench, but they got a different background story on why they're working on this particular problem.
So Jens, how many of these people did you actually get to meet? I mean, were you given complete freedom to just move about these facilities? It doesn't sound like a very movable place, actually.
Yeah, so that's also complicated. So let me finish this onion story and get back to this. And then the next layer of that would be that people would then look under those biodefense people who are the most trusted and the most patriotic and the most skilled and so on, and they would call them in and then say, well, actually, we are really interested in offensive things, right? So the U.S. is building biological weapons, so we need to build biological weapons to be able to counterstrike or to strike first. I mean, however you want to phrase it. And so, therefore, we are developing diagnostic systems here if we get attacked, but we're really interested in also developing things to attack. And so that was a very small group. But this group of people still worked side by side next to all these other guys. So it was very difficult to see who knew what and who was how deeply involved and so on.
Sure.
And the trick overall seemed to be that very few people in these institutes had actually any idea about the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention. So they were simply told the U.S. is developing still biological weapons. And if somebody would actually bring up the Biological Weapons Convention, they would say, well, the U.S. is lying. We have intelligence that they're still doing that. And that would ultimately, of course, trigger the patriotism of saying, okay, if the great evil country over there is doing this to our nation, then we need to defend, and then they would get into this.
Jens, I got a little lost. What time are we talking about now where there might be, say, 3 people working at the bench side by side with 3 different backstories as to what they were doing?
This is all up to 1993.
Okay, this is prior to 93.
Yeah,
okay.
all up to the end of the program. There was this incredible mix of different secrecy layers with different clearances in these huge institutes. And so when the assistance programs came in, typically nobody knew who was who, right? Okay. So because there's still a law in place, as far as I know, in Russia that anybody who talks about the program, faces criminal charges and severe criminal charges. So there are very few people who are living in Russia who will talk about the program. That's basically perilous to their own existence. And of the people who left Russia, those people are also very cautious in talking about it because, of course, they have family in the country still, right? So,
okay, and just to clarify one more thing then, what is the timing of the assistance programs? Is pre or post 93?
That's post 93.
The Soviet Union Threat Reduction Act of the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction thing is dated 1991.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
It was the Soviet Nuclear Threat Reduction Act at the time, I think. And then it got transformed.
Yes.
Yes, that's right.
So in these laboratories, did they also have another group working on vaccines in case things went sour?
Yes. So, and so ultimately, nobody knew about this program until the defectors came out. Then through the crumbling of the Soviet Union, everybody got panicky and said, oh my God, there was this huge program, and what are we going to do with all these people? Then they built these grant assistance programs really quickly to help in some kind of a way, in a quiet way, so that nobody knew that expertise was on the market or like loose nukes would fly around and whatever. But within all of this, there was a huge mess, and maybe it's still, I would say it's probably still a certain mess, of actually knowing who you're dealing with and why you're dealing with certain people. So you did not know whether the people who would apply for your grant assistance were people on that first onion layer, the second onion layer, the third onion layer. They would certainly not tell you. And you would also not know, and that's slowly we're getting to what I did, you would also not know what actually happened with that money that you made available. Right. I mean, this is very similar to like the grant programs that we have. Right. I mean, you apply for a grant because you want to do X, Y, and Z. And then if the reviewers say, yeah, this is great, they're going to give you money. And then you can do stuff with that money. But it's very rare that there's a verification program where they come back to you and say, well, if you didn't do X, Y, and Z, we want our money back. And so it's the same thing here. So there was a very good intention of saying, okay, we're gonna help us and we're gonna help them at the same time to secure these bioweaponeers and the knowledge and everything else. So we're gonna give them money to do public health, and then they would say, oh, thank you very much, but you did not. There was no knowledge of whether they would actually do something in public health with them, right? I mean, you can fabricate a report where you said where you write 17 ELISAs have been produced for antiviruses, and use the money for something else. So there was a verification problem ultimately of, is anything useful being done with this money, and how does the transformation of these former secret facilities actually move forward?
So Jens, how many of these scientists took the alternate route and actually did go to other countries to still work on bioweapons? No matter what.
I mean, do you think he's going to know? He's going to know.
How would he know that?
Of those? Yeah.
Well,
right.
I mean, there's a world of intrigue involved in all of this, isn't there?
Right.
Because you could write novel after novel about, John Clancy or Clancy.
The one person who knew it all, right? So there's so as far as we can tell, and again, I mean, I'm not privy to all the secret information. I have no idea, but as far as we can tell, very, very, very few people from this program went into countries that at that time would have been considered enemies. So the majority of the people that emigrated from Russia and the successor countries went to the US, to the UK, and to Europe, but not to, as it was feared at the time, to Iran and other places. And most of these people, as far as we can tell, were also on the junior scientists. So junior scientists at 1993, and then of course, more experienced by the time all the assistance programs actually kicked in. So they were on the outer layers of this little onion, and they integrated very nicely at the NIH and at many institutes in the US, where they are now doing regular research as we all do. So but yeah, it's absolutely right. I don't know actually how many there were. I mean, how would I? And it's also very difficult to tell how many people really knew something and emigrated, and how many people who really knew something stayed. For sure, the Russian intelligence service looked out for these special people who knew a lot. And then there's also the way how the system was built was a highly compartmentalized, highly secret program, and they had these, let's call them recipes, huge booklets on how to get from the starter culture of a certain bacterium all the way to creating a bomb in safes that were guarded by KGB agents. So every one of these institutes had a KGB office where everything that was written or would go out or go in, of course, would go through the KGB, and typically only like 2 or 3 people of these entire institutes had access to these entire recipes. And all the other people always had basically one sub-protocol of this conveyor belt that they knew. So even if one of them would run around or defect or go into a different country, they wouldn't be able to do much with this. It's not like, bioweapons and then you can build a bioweapon. So there were safeguards built into that system.
Mm-hmm. So Jens, what do you think, your personal opinion is this whole program now reanimated in Russia?
Well, I'm not involved in all of these things anymore, so I don't think I can really make an honest judgment on this. Okay. I would say that through the dismantling of this program definitely took a massive hit. Mm-hmm. So if the program still exists, it exists on a scale that is much, much, much smaller than it used to be. Mm-hmm. Also, of course, the program and Russia has been on the radar screen of the intelligence services of all the other countries in the world. And now, of course, they're looking out for signature moves of bioweapon systems. Mm-hmm. And there are many of them, right? So starting from like smokestacks that you would see in big facilities, huge industrial compounds that you can see on satellite imagery, to unusual orders of certain reagents in quantities that are not normal, and all of this other stuff. So there's certainly much more surveillance on this. There are things that trouble me personally, and that is that there are institutes that were involved in that program and that are still absolutely inaccessible. So, for example, the Ministry of Defense Institute in Sergiev Posad, which is the virology institute under the army, is an institute that is completely closed to outsiders. So you cannot even go there if you as a foreigner, you cannot go there to even have a meeting in a meeting room, right? So you cannot enter it. And that ultimately troubles me from a transparency point of view. So I understand, of course, that that military has secrets, and we also have classified facilities and everything else. But I think a certain transparency should be provided to outsiders, and that is the biggest problem with the Biological Weapons Convention of 1972. There's no real verification scheme in there. There's nothing where you have if you have a suspicion, then you have a suspicion, but you can't just go over there and say, open your doors. Whereas in the Chemical Weapons Convention, you do have exactly this.
Yeah.
You have a mechanism to.
In some of the reading materials you supplied, it was clear they were making huge quantities of many things, including variola virus, right? So do we know if these were destroyed or they went somewhere else? Do we have any knowledge of that?
Yeah, the problem with all of this is you will have to define knowledge. So yes, officially everything has been destroyed. There are documents that say so.
Okay.
For some things, we know they were destroyed because they were destroyed with foreign representatives of foreign governments present or helping actually within these grant assistance programs. So, for example, I mentioned the facility in Stepnogorsk. That was dismantled and destroyed in its entirety through these assistance programs. So with money from the European Union and the US, they leveled this entire field. The variola program, I know relatively little about the variola program. So, but as far as I know, the mass quantities were destroyed, and there's a very good transparency measure on the Russian side that was installed with the agreement with everybody. So there are cameras in the building at Vector where smallpox research is being performed. That can be overseen from the outside, and the same thing with CDC, and they're watching each other very closely to ensure that everything is kosher and right. So there, it certainly looked good, and I would say the fact that Russia agreed to all of these assistance programs and they flourished for quite some time very nicely certainly shows the right intent on all sides. But of course, it's a huge country with huge little secret compound somewhere, so hard to say.
You didn't. So what did you do while you were there, and what was your experience like with the other scientists and with the labs?
Well, so I mentioned the problem was, we provide money and we don't know what happens with the money. And so when I was approached that I would like to go there, basically what was explained to me is we want to have feet on the ground to see whether the machines that were said to be bought with that assistance money, are they actually in the labs? And are the researchers actually doing public health projects? And then if not, or if you see any problems with this, what do you think can be done with the infrastructure that is there and with the research expertise that is there? And so this was a confidence building measure, right? So I was not there to check on the Russian colleagues or anything like this. It was more like we would like to, if we want to make an institute a truly transparent research institute that is integrated in the international research society, it should be possible to get a student into the laboratories to do a rotation. So very simple idea, right? And it turned out to be incredibly complicated to do this. And the United States tried to get people into the laboratory, typically highly renowned people with, professors and tenured and huge publication records and everything else, and try to get them into these laboratories. And for 16,000 reasons and another, it never came to fruition. And so this is all interpretation on my side now, because you never know exactly why you were chosen for anything. But I think in my favor it worked that I was a student at the time, so I was wonderfully naive. I didn't know anything about anything. And I was also a German citizen, so which might help to go over there, right? So you don't bring the adversary into the laboratory. You basically bring an intermediate and student who obviously doesn't know much, and then we can work easier with each other. It's important, of course, to remember that there's a certain kind of pride element when assistance programs happen like this, right? So, I mean, if I go to Vincent Labs tomorrow and they say, "Hey, Vincent, I'm going to help you grow polio," Vincent will look at me and will say, "It's very nice of you, but get the heck out of here." So this is very similar, right? So you had highly accomplished scientists who were experts on very complicated, very challenging problems. And in came administrators from grant assistant programs who would tell them now that you need to stop doing what you were doing, but you're going to do what I'm going to tell you to do, because otherwise you don't get the grant money. And then I'm going to check on you regularly whether you're really doing this right. Right? So there is a certain kind of problem in like accepting this kind of new reality, I would say, and justifiably so. So the idea actually of bringing a highly renowned professor in ultimately probably would have caused problems. Right. Whereas if I go in as a student, I'm the know nothing. And so then they can actually advise me how to do my experiments. And at the same time, I can say, yeah, these experiments were actually done because I was part of it. I think that was the idea behind that. So in the end, I went over there and naively I thought, oh, cool. And the next day I'm going to go in the lab and I'm going to start lab work. But of course, it hasn't been done before. There has never been an outsider in this facility who would actually do anything other than the grant assistant managers going into a meeting room and discussing of what will be done and then getting an obligatory tour of the premise, whatever was allowed to be seen, right? But it typically didn't go into like a BSL-3 or BSL-4 lab or anything. And so when I arrived there were a lot of problems to be overcome, and not necessarily unlike any other facility that deals with high consequence pathogens, right? So it starts with the question of like, well, do you actually have all the vaccines? Or do you have the necessary biosafety training? And you need a cycle evaluation.
That's right.
That's right. Like all of these different things, and some of these things were foreseeable, right? So we could work on this prior before I was on the ground. And some of these things nobody thought would be necessary, but were justified. And some things were stalling tactics to make it more complicated for me to get into the lab. And so there was I would say there was a power struggle at the time between the individual stakeholders of these institutes of whether my visit should become a success or not a success, depending on what each individual's fate was, depending on what I would do. Right. So for the scientists, I would say it was a great thing for me to come over there because it was one step into freedom for them and to become scientists and be recognized with publications and everything else. For the security forces, I was a major threat. Because if the institute is open, security forces are not needed anymore. So there was a little bit of back and forth and stuff, and so depending on who you talk to, I was either the person who brings all golden age, and for the other people, I was an American spy who would bring entire Russia down. So it was an interesting place to be in, and depending on who had which kind of say, the requirements for me to go in the lab changed on a daily basis, and so it took several weeks for me to figure out how to actually finally put my foot into a lab and say, okay, now I want to have a pipette and let's do something. And that was done. I had a very good setup. So I had an interpreter with me at all time because I didn't speak Russian. I learned very, very little of survival Russian, but not enough to have a conversation. So I have an interpreter with me at all times, and she would help me with translation of biosafety documents so I could actually pass the biosafety tests in Russian. And that would be given, and then I needed to see doctors and all of this other stuff. So there was always something different, and I needed to figure out every day, like, okay, how am I going to do this? How am I going to do this? And the former director of my facility, he always called me a persistent little bastard, and so that's exactly what I am. So I said, okay, I'm going to figure this out. And so at the end, I made it into the laboratory. And so I went into the laboratory of Vladimir Petrov. I'm not really sure whether he's still there, but he is an expert on Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever virus in the Soviet Union, so in Russia and the newly independent states, mainly doing ecology at the time.
And that is a genuine infectious disease problem in Russia, right?
Correct. So CCHF is a BSL-4 virus here in the United States. It is a BSL, well, they don't have these levels, they have different designations, but the equivalent of a BSL-3 virus over there. And it's endemic in the European part of Russia and the and NIS. It's Ukraine, Crimea, Kazakhstan, and all of these places. It's a tick-borne virus. It causes a hemorrhagic fever in humans with a case fatality rate of about 2% or higher, depending on which strain you get and where you are. And so therefore, it is a legitimate public health problem for these countries. And at the same time, it is a legitimate public health problem in Africa, in China, in many, many other areas. And so learning something about this virus would certainly benefit the entire world. And so the idea there was that we would do simple epidemiological studies where we would collect ticks or get collected ticks, mush them up and then try to see, do they have CCHF or not? And if they have CCHF, then can we figure out anything about the strain by doing a very rudimentary PCR and sequencing of small fragments to figure out where in the phylogenetic tree do they fit and so on. So it was a very, very simple project, but not simple to do because by the time I arrived there was 2001. The program crumbled in 1993. So you had 8 years of the institute ultimately disintegrating, except for whatever the grant assistant programs would provide. And so the laboratories at the time when I walked in, they were a very interesting mix of looking like buildings that have disintegrated 6 decades ago, short of the moss growing on the walls, and in between having the most modern PCR machine. So it was a very weird mix because, of course, it was dependent on how the individual researchers would write their grants and how well these grants would be written. That would decide which kind of machinery and infrastructure you would get and which kind of project you would work on. So there were parts of the building that were completely dilapidated and some parts that were modernized. Some walls were painted and others were not. And so when I started there, we still did PCR in this laboratory with water baths. So sitting there with a stopwatch and then, going from sample to water bath to water bath.
So yeah. What I liked of a lot of the stuff that you gave us to read was really interesting, but this one, which is the first person account, and it starts with chapter 12 at the top, and has pictures of the lab and so forth, I found really interesting. And so if people were going to check something out, this might be the thing to look at.
That's the Nature article, right?
No. It's a chapter that he calls the first person book chapter. The Kuhn anthology.
Kuhn anthology, right. We'll put a link to that.
Chapter 12 at the top. Yeah.
It was covered. You got a lot of press coverage too, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it was a big breakthrough in the end that somebody could actually simply put their feet, not my science. It was really just like, somebody having their feet in this laboratory and doing something that is peaceful and whatever. And that got a lot of press coverage. So Nature reported on this, which was very nice. Of course, I was young and saw my picture in Nature. It was great. And I ended up on German TV with the then Interior Minister discussing bioterrorism and all other crazy things. So it was a very exciting time. I ended up in every newspaper in Germany, and it was fun, I have to say, and very intimidating. Because of course you always watched what you say, and there's a certain nervousness even during this TWiV that I say something that will like anger somebody somewhere.
How long were you there in total?
It was like 5 months, so not too long.
And was it before or after 9/11? Because it was 2001.
It was during. So this was actually one of the most interesting things for me because that was at the end of my time. I think I was there until mid-October, so beginning of October. So when 9/11 happened, I expected, probably unfairly so and very stereotype of me, but I expected either indifference or a certain kind of glee on the Russian side, because of course, I also grew up with in being indoctrinated, the Russians are the evil ones. And it was exactly the opposite. So I was somehow seen as American, despite the fact that I was German, but I was basically closer to American than anything else. And so there were dozens and dozens of people who were crying and who came to me to give me condolences for the horror that happened. And it was a very, very interesting thing. And many of the researchers actually came to me and said, "This is the biggest catastrophe to the grant assistance program because this will mean that the United States will start building up their military programs, and that will mean that all this rhetoric of enemies and everything else will start, and they will seclude themselves and isolate themselves again like before, and they will not be willing anymore to help, and and it will go down. And it's to a certain degree was actually a harbinger of the future what actually happened to the programs, because under Bush certainly these programs went down.
And then right after 9/11 was the anthrax thing. Were you still there during that?
Yeah, because that was only 2 weeks later or something.
Yeah,
right.
So I think yeah. But I was right on the time that I think I left actually.
Yeah, it was closer to October because I was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I left a week before or after. I remember that I had to go through airports, and it was a huge concern of how easy it would be for me to get back to the States. But this might have been either directly from Russia to get back, or after I was already back and I had to go to the US for like debriefings and other things and stuff. But it was all around about that time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it was a very interesting time. So so that's ultimately what I did in the lab, right? So I walked in every day after I got in, and I would get my mushed up tick somewhere, and I would run ELISAs and try to see whether we find any CCHF antigen in something, and if we do, then we would run PCRs with some rudimentary primers that we designed, and see whether we could have a band on the gel. And we actually published papers with this. Right. So, I mean, there were simple papers, there were Archives of Virology papers and Journal of General Virology papers and everything else. But these were the first characterizations of Tajikistan and Kazakh and so on, CCHF strains and small phylogenetic trees at the time. So this was not rocket science, but I have to say that I have never been so proud of my science, my actual science, than I was when I worked in Russia and I managed to get the first negative control on my PCR gel. Because you have to understand that these grant assistance programs, I mean, they were not multi-billion-dollar programs. So individual things would come in, but these individual things, because they were modern and new, were then shared by everybody. Mm-hmm. And we had one pipette set, like the typical like P20, P200, so we had one pipette set for the entire floor.
Oh my God.
And we would use that pipette set for everything from like grinding up the ticks and putting the mush into the ground to and we didn't have any filtered tips. And all of this. So we would use the same pipetters for everything, including our PCR.
It's too bad you missed our pre-program discussion. You would have been perfect for it. Because, Kathy and Rich had a spirited discussion about the small pipettes and tall pipettes and their difficulties in cleaning.
Yeah, I mean, this was amazing, and the Russian colleagues that I had, I mean, to today, I'm in complete awe of. They knew the history of their pipettes. They would watch where the pipette is going and what it was doing and who would work with what and whatnot. And their gels would be pristine and beautiful and clean, and I would start doing something and everything was a mess. So this was amazing. This was also like, when this was still the time where you had to develop film by hand in a dark chamber, and and there was no light in the chamber. They all knew. They're basically like blind people. They knew exactly where to go and what was there. And I would go in there and hit my head every 5 seconds. So the people that I worked with were amazing. I mean, like really, they were absolutely amazing. They were technically so skilled, despite the fact that they didn't have any technology around. But what they could do with this little stuff was flabbergasting. And it was a super friendly atmosphere. And, at lunch every day was a lot of fun. And the people were truly interested in actually getting results and publishing a paper. And then, of course, I had some English knowledge, so I could help with writing the papers. And so all of this was great. And so it's very difficult to reconcile the actual experience that I had, where it was a lot of fun going out with people in the evening. I was there in the summertime, so Siberia there was no snow whatsoever. It was super hot and humid and tons of mosquitoes and ticks everywhere. And then they have this huge artificial lake, the Ob Lake over there. We would go to the beach and have beach volleyball and beach barbecues and like all of these things that
lots of vodka.
Well, that too. So all of this stuff that didn't fit with my image, and at the same time having this kind of gloomy umbrella of biowarfare and bioweapons transformation, arms control all over this. And then, of course, people telling me I should not trust this person and the other person telling me I should not trust that person. So it was very confusing. But I did this
is it true then that you, among these people you were working with, could have been individuals from any layer of the onion?
Yeah, I would say so.
So some of these individuals could have been really on the inside of the bioweapons program. Others were more like the technicians on the outside who had no idea what was going on. Is that the case?
That's certainly possible. There's no way for me to know
right.
that.
There's no way you can know, right.
And as with all of these questions, you always can argue from two different angles. The one is, of course, some of them were around because they wanted to have an eye on me and stuff and what I would be doing, right? And then the other angle is, no, none of these people were around because people were afraid that I would get information from them and channel it back to the U.S. I mean, there were concerns, of course, on their side that I would be, American intelligence and all of this different stuff. And then I would always point out that I'm German and have a German passport, and they would say, like, yeah, but the Germans work with the U.S. And so I mean, like, if this is like with all conspiracy theories, if you're convinced that somebody is a bad guy, he's going to be a bad guy. A little bit like the discussions that you have every other week on vaccines. If you're convinced that vaccines cause autism, then vaccines cause autism. You can do whatever you want.
Do you realize that there was a misinformation hacking?
My pick of the week.
That's your pick of the week. It's incredible, isn't it?
Jens, I wanted to ask one question back on your interpreter. Did the interpreter know German and Russian and English, or just Russian and one other language that helped you?
So the interpreted was in English, Russian, English.
Okay.
But the interpreter that I worked with was probably one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. And we're still friends, actually, and she's actually in the U.S. by now. So she taught herself German from books.
I see.
And actually could converse with me quite well in German as well. I mean, like, broken and not on a level that you can use for like official meetings and stuff, but she was quite well. And she was also a linguist by training, and she speaks some of these very rare and small languages of the Altai Mountains and stuff. And she was pretty brilliant. Is pretty brilliant.
Okay.
So Jens, we had planned to talk a little bit about dual use and gain of function, but I think we don't have enough time. Probably we should save that for another episode. Would that be? But I do want to get through a couple of things that you had sent in an email. We talked about what a bioweapon is, but then you said, what's the difference between biocrime, bioterrorism, and biowarfare?
Mm-hmm.
Can we just address that? Yeah.
So, I mean, if you look at all the high consequence pathogens programs that we have in the US or in other countries, it's a little bit easy to forget that the root of all of these institutes was actually the fear that somebody could attack you with something, right? So the public health threat of Ebola was not really on anybody's radar screen for a very long time. They caused little small outbreaks somewhere. There were exotic viruses that were never mentioned in any virology book or something. I mean, they got a little bit of, so Ebola virus got a little bit of notoriety with outbreak in the hot zone. But there were very few people who knew about Marburg or Kaiserslautern disease virus and all these other things. So the institutes that had an interest in this were typically government institutes that looked into exotic little threats, and typically also threats to soldiers when they get, not in the sense of biowarfare threats, but threats of like natural agents that soldiers could encounter when they get deployed somewhere. So that's, for example, one of the reasons of the existence of all the Naval Medical Research Units, NAMRU, because people are working in certain ports and they might get exposed to this, and so we need to know a little bit about all of these viruses and so on. And when this biodefense thing first started, and it was certainly fueled through the combination of the 9/11 airplane attacks combined with the anthrax letters, which were very quickly conflated. Right? A lot of people suddenly said, what if the anthrax spores would have been on the planes? Well, they would have burned. But it makes a nice story of like suddenly like, anthrax all over New York. People started like willy-nilly like saying things about bioweapons, and they forget that there are different reasons why somebody would want to use a bioweapon. And with that come a different sophistication that you need to invest. And so that's why ultimately there's a differentiation between biocrimes, bioterrorism, and biowarfare, because all of them need a different kind of infrastructure, have different kind of intent, and also need different kind of defenses. So if you look at biocrimes are things that have been around forever. So if I, let's not take me all the time, I feel bad about saying I all the time. If a person knows he is HIV infected, and he has sex with somebody else to deliberately infect that person with HIV, then you have committed a biocrime, right? And if you go all the way to the old Agatha Christie novels or whatever, and you put insulin in a syringe and you shoot somebody up with this to cause a heart failure, then actually you had a bioweapon, right? You had a dispersal device with a biological agent in it, and you committed a crime, you committed murder. So that is biocrime. And so criminal...
Or Sonny von Bülow, by the way, don't forget there was a real case of that. Not just Agatha Christie. And she was a patient right here where we are.
Yeah. There are many. So in fact, there's a book by Seth Karras on a history of all the biocrimes and bioterrorist events that have been recorded, step by one. You can get it on Amazon. It is an amazing, amazing work. And so there are many of these things where like students thought it would be funny to take, some kind of a helmet or something and put
that
it
happened.
On somebody.
That happened.
Yeah.
All Montreal gave somebody ascaris that way. That was crazy. Putting it in the oatmeal of all things.
That's right. So this is biocrime, right? And so as the word said, I mean, there's legal. I'm not a lawyer, but I mean, there are legal definitions of what makes a crime, right? And so and typically the motivations of crimes are what we see on TV every day, right? There's jealousy, there's monetary gain, there's revenge, like all of these things. But crimes do not have the goal of toppling governments or convincing everybody to believe in the following God or this kind of stuff, right? So it's a criminal activity. And then there's bioterrorism. And bioterrorism, as the word says, is a terroristic activity. And so until, I would say, 10 years ago, that was very well defined. Terrorists were groups that had political interests. So political interests in the sense of wanting to gain awareness for a particular cause, toppling that particular government, bringing another country to ruins. So if you think terrorism, you think Red Army faction, ETA, the Ireland, like those kind of groups, and would they do something to change the political landscape, and would biological weapons be useful for them in any kind of way?
So would sarin release in the Tokyo, would that be bioterrorism?
Yes. Well, that would be chemical terrorism because sarin is not bio. But yes. So Aum Shinrikyo, I would say, would be a terrorist group. Yeah. And so it depends basically on the intent of a group of like how sophisticated you have to get. So if you think about the Red Nationalist thing in the Dales, where this cult sprayed with salmonella, I think, salmonella on salad bars with the idea of making people sick so they cannot go to vote,
right? So
that their candidate wins, right? That is a terroristic act,
right?
And it's a bioterrorist act. And for doing that, all that was really necessary was a few cultures of salmonella. So there was no sophisticated weapons development, no tactical and strategic considerations and all this other stuff. But of course, the impact, if you think about human lives or national security in that sense, is relatively little, right? So, you won't bring the U.S. down with salad bar attacks. Mm-hmm. So the defense is different, right? You're watching different kind of people. They of course also, they might be more clandestine than states. They might actually be more visible than states. They might have religious purposes and stuff and want to bring doomsday. They might only want to change, some local problem that they see in their community. And then there's biowarfare, and biowarfare is ultimately a state activity. It's a nation that says, okay, we're developing a program where we have an arsenal of things that we can deploy tactically in a theater or even strategically against our adversary in retaliation or as a first strike capability. And then, of course, there's all the gray in between, where you have terrorist programs that are sponsored by nations. Then it gets complicated. But those are typically the differences. Right. And so a very.
You mean there's no SMERSH?
Right. So if you look at Ebola virus, it's a very interesting example, right? So I would argue that Ebola virus is a terrible source material for a bioweapon, because we ultimately know how to stop the outbreak.
Right.
So if there's an outbreak of Ebola virus in the United States, and if you inform people and say don't touch each other anymore, and if people listen to that, then theoretically nothing really bad will happen, right? With all these ifs and caveats. It's going to be, and if you have enough casualties in the beginning, panic will spread and people will probably stop touching each other because they get panicked, they might get it. So you will probably be able to contain this. At the same time, if you think about the effect that like the single case of Ebola virus had in Texas, in terms of media attention and economic impact and treatment costs and everything else, then of course it is an effective thing in some kind of a way.
Right.
But the way how you want to defend against this, or the way how you want to build response teams and everything else, is completely different when you think about economical impacts, whereas if you think mass casualty weapon. And so that's when all of this discussion becomes incredibly complicated. And so whenever somebody says, oh, this is a bioweapon, I start cringing, because I'm always sitting there and saying, for what purpose do you think it is, and how do you think it will be deployed, and what do you think the effects are, and what do you think we should be doing about it, rather than this, willy-nilly throwing out there and saying Bacillus anthracis is bad. The same thing when people say it's so easy to grow and you can just go outside in the earth and undig it because Bacillus anthracis is everywhere. Yeah, but not that Bacillus anthracis that makes people sick, right? All of this stuff is challenging and complicated.
That's right.
And if you look at the Soviet biological weapons program, I mean, if you force your way through Ray's and Milton's book, you will see there was a huge program, tens of thousands of scientists, billions of rubles invested, and very little to show for. Right? So in the end, the classical bioweapons, the one from the 50s, 60s, 70s, where you just grew up, the dirty dozen agents, and coded them and stuff. Yeah, there were some of these weapons were deployed and they were functional, whatever. But for these things, we also by now have antibiotics and vaccines and I don't know what out there. So there's already countermeasures. But the modern program that focused on manipulation of these agents, building chimeras, and all of these very fancy sounding ideas, they never led to any deployment of a weapon. They failed because, as we all know, if you try to even put a GFP virus into an GFP gene into an RNA virus, well, the virus will be avirulent and not do anything anymore. And after a while, it will kick the GFP out. And no matter what you create, there's evolutionary forces and selection and so on. And selection becomes incredibly important if you want to grow hundreds of liters of something, right? So this is a very complicated problem to deal with. And that's ultimately why bioweapons are considered to be state-supported things, because there needs to be a lot of effort, and it's not going to be the Taliban who's sitting in a cave somewhere and order some reagents from Amazon.
That's what we've always said here on TWiV. Can't do this in a cave. But
right.
I always think that, non-biological terrorist tools are known to work, right? And you never know about an infectious agent delivered to a population. You don't know what the outcome is going to be. And as you say, if you modify it, you're probably destroying it. There was, in one of these books, they were talking about putting Western equine encephalitis genome into smallpox virus.
Right.
And that would I would predict that would never work. Right?
But there's a lot of these. There's a lot of these things. So it's very difficult for me. So I actually get into fights with Milton and Ray over this when we talk about the accomplishments of the program. So I have a suspicion that at least a certain proportion of the alleged successes that were reported were simply reported because you had to report successes. These were huge programs with money and functionaries sitting on top. They wanted to see results. And so people probably made up a certain amount, at least, of data to say that something has happened. And then there's the interesting question of, okay, I would agree with you that putting somehow Western equine encephalitis, I think it was VE, not WEV, it doesn't matter, one of those encephalitis viruses, to put them into the variola virus genome would never work, and they couldn't have gotten it to work in 1985, right? I mean, So short of the Soviet Union really being a decade ahead of us in terms of infectious clone work and other things, the knowledge of this technology was just not there. So I don't think so. But there's an interesting question to be asked of whether these things would be possible today or not.
Or in the future. You should never say something is never possible, right?
Right. And there is a study that was published a couple of years ago in PLOS ONE, where people, I think it was a Chinese group, put in the attenuated form of influenza virus, basically the influenza virus vaccine strain, into Salmonella as a way of vaccinating large numbers of livestock in factory farms, because Salmonella spreads very quickly from chicken to chicken, or however this works. And so they thought if this would actually produce the vaccine strain, then everything would get vaccinated. And so the idea is the same, right? So you put a virus into some other agent, and I would have predicted that this would never work because I could not foresee a possibility of getting flu. Aside from the fact of getting rightly glycosylated and all this other stuff in a prokaryotic cell through the cell membrane and the cell wall and everything else and get them out or whatever, but that worked. So there are follow-up papers on that, right? And so, I mean, maybe it is because the cells lyse or something, or I don't know how exactly this works, and I haven't really followed up on it. So there are certainly things that change over time, and our abilities to manipulate viruses with reverse genetic system has certainly increased too. That's, of course, why we need oversight. That's why we need regulatory bodies, and that's why we need better communication on what we're doing and why we're doing it.
And that should be the topic of our next Jens episode, right? We can talk about that and dual use and all that stuff. I wanted to just review some of the literature we've cited. You talked about the this book, which is the Soviet Biological Weapons Program, A History. It's from Harvard University Press. It was published in 2012. And that's Leitenberg, Zelinskas, and Kuhn. And then we talked about a Nature article that gives some background on your work. Then we talked about another article, which is written by you. That's the anthology one. And then there's something we didn't mention, but it's interesting. It's an article in Nature where you and two other authors rip apart one of the typical nonsense stories about the Soviet bioweapons program. This was, I guess, a book by a former KGB person who, and they said they said ridiculous things that every new emerging infection was a bioweapons program product, right? So we should put that link in so people can see that. And then what I really liked is this book, Medical Aspects of Biological Warfare, which is available on the Internet Archive and has a huge number of chapters on. So the first chapter is wonderful because it's a history of biological warfare, very comprehensive, which I really liked. And then it has individual chapters on different viral agents. And I think that's a really, really interesting book as well. You said
that's the standard work basically for the military for all of these aspects.
And then you mentioned another one on biocrimes. What was that again?
That's Seth Karus, SETH, and Karus, CARUS. And I don't know what the title is, but it's basically a history of everything. You find that on Amazon if you type in
History of Biocrimes, right? All right, great. Yeah. All right. Does anyone have anything else before we wrap up with picks?
There's a ton of interesting material to discuss, including what is your favorite organism for weaponizing? I'm sure you don't have one because that would be tantamount to telling somebody how to do it. But and that's the biggest problem.
I in general don't have any favorite organisms for any nefarious purpose.
Yeah, exactly right.
But as he said, Ebola wouldn't be a good one. In general, anything that you know how to take care of, polio, smallpox, influenza, it's the unknowns, right? Where it's rare and doesn't happen very often and no one's worked on it, right? But as Jens, go ahead.
I would say it's the unknowns, but it's also the knowns that we don't care about anymore.
Right.
So if you get to the point of, let's take polio, right? So if polio virus actually gets eradicated, And then we come up with the brilliant idea that because it's eradicated, nobody needs to be vaccinated anymore against polio. Then, of course, polio becomes a very interesting bioweapons agent. And so, if people become complacent with their vaccines and everything else, I mean, they're setting up populations to be vulnerable not only from natural disease outbreaks.
Of course. Totally.
4,000 cases of measles in Europe this year.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, it is insane. Absolutely insane.
Historically, how successful has any bioweapons program been?
He said not all. None of them.
Well,
yeah.
Well, this is again one of those wonderful, complicated questions, because what do you mean with successful? So is successful a program that has actually resulted in weapons being stored somewhere that could have been deployed? Or is successful something where weapons have actually been deployed and changed some kind of a war or conflict? Or is successful a program that actually hasn't achieved anything, but because it existed, it changed the political landscape and resulted in non-proliferation treaties or threats and all these other things, right? So there's a lot of political components there that which ultimately is what I really would like to talk with you about in another TWiV.
Right.
It is the question of how do you interpret an experiment that is being done, not from a scientific point of view in the sense of does it move science forward, or from the people who are afraid of the risk and say this should never been done because we might all die if this escapes. But how are experiments being perceived by intelligence agents who analyze alleged countries that are hostile, and how do you tell them that what you're doing is actually legitimate?
Yeah, that'd be great. We'd love to do that. Mm-hmm. All right, we're going to do some picks. Jens, you want to stick around, or do you want to go now?
Well, I'll stick around first of all, and also I have picks.
Very good. All right. Well, let's start with you, Jens. What do you got for us?
I have two picks, and I'll send you the links for this. So the first one is called The Beastly Garden of Wordy Delights. It's a website. It's www.anapsid.org. And this is a list for geeky people like me who are not native English speakers. And it lists all the collective nouns for animals for you. So if you wanted to know what a group of butterflies are called.
Oh, yeah, heraldry.
Oh, great.
Heraldry.
That's right. It's a flutter.
It's fantastic. A flutter of butterflies?
A flutter of butterflies.
Or a murder of crows? Yeah.
That's right. An intrusion of cockroaches.
I love it. I love it.
And, So
an exudate of dermatologists?
Yeah. And it ultimately brings up the frustrated question of any English learner, why don't you guys do this like any other language in the world where you have one word called group?
Right. Right.
So this is fun, and I have a second pick, and the second pick is at www.vibrancy.net, and that is images of nudibranchs. Those are absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, and we'll have to exchange emails because I've got a slew of them also. Plus, they also have mantises.
Yep. I think there's nothing prettier than nudibranchs.
I totally agree. I absolutely, totally agree.
Cool. That's great.
We work on them over here, by the way. This. We do research on them. We pick apart their brains and destroy them.
Yeah. What do you mean by here?
Aplesia.
Yeah, aplesia is a nudibranch.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, we've.
They just found the largest RNA virus in aplesia, I think.
Really?
Is that right?
BioArchives. Yeah, it's a BioArchives paper. So there are two papers. They're similar. One is from Sasha Gobelenia, and the other one I forgot.
That's right.
And one of them is aplesia. One of them is planaria.
Goodness.
And they're both nidoviruses. And the one of them is 38 kb, and the other one is 41 or something. So huge. They basically burst this whole era catastrophe idea that we always had about RNA viruses into
cool.
pieces. So,
Sasha had told me about that. A planarian nidovirus expands the limit of RNA genome size.
Yeah, that's right. So that's my third pick then.
That is 41 kb.
Whoa.
Yeah.
And I think he had told so now the theoretical maximum is much greater, right? Bless you.
Right. And not really understood why and how this could happen, which is a very interesting question. You should get Sasha on the show.
All right, Rich, what do you have?
I'm looking at this list of groups. It's amazing. A bale of turtles.
What do you call a bunch of stoneflies?
I don't know.
A cohort.
A bale of weapons, huh?
Bale of weapons. That's right.
Okay, my pick is an article that my wife pointed out to me. That is called "Living Inside a Canister." Dallas polio survivor is one of the few people left in the U.S. using an iron lung. I think we've had, so it's a link to a Dallas newspaper article about this guy who is 72 years old, and he is still living in an iron lung, and because he was a polio victim when he was 6 years old.
Good Lord.
Yeah.
So he has been in an iron lung for whatever 72 minus 6 is.
Holy cow.
66 years.
Some of the time he was able to be in a wheelchair, it said. But
yes. So this is something I've never really fully appreciated about iron lung victims, but there are degrees of paralysis that affect your respiration. And some people, for part of the day or for part of their lives, have been able to live without the iron lung. This guy, he got polio when he was 6 years old. He went to law school,
right? And
he had a career as a lawyer. And it does mention a wheelchair, and he talks about learning to breathe.
Wow.
Okay, so I think that it sounds as if, although it's not stated specifically, that for part of his life at least, he was able to spend significant periods of time outside the iron lung. But it also sounds as if breathing under those circumstances was a very, very deliberate exercise. It's not something involuntary like we do now. It's something that he had to teach himself how to do.
Right.
My wife pointed this out to me just out of interest, and I think we've had picks like this before at one time or another. But I think it's really important as we've talked about how data can't convince people who are anti-vax to come around in their positions, but anecdotes do. Mm-hmm. And this is a really impressive anecdote. And the guy talks about a lot of the article is interviewing the guy, and he talks about what it was like to live during the polio epidemic, and he has some comments about the effectiveness of vaccines as well. So I thought it was interesting.
So there's no alternative to an iron lung for someone like this? There's no other technology?
Apparently not.
No?
Apparently not. So the modern respirators don't do the trick.
Oh.
And his muscles are now failed so much that there's nothing else that can be done.
Wow. So
he can't get his iron lung fixed.
Yeah.
Nobody does this anymore.
I know. I've seen them in museums. There is one on eBay. Someone sent that to us once.
That's right.
Wow. So they said there's an Amazon Echo on near his head, and they ask, "What's the Echo for?" He grins. "Rock and roll," he says.
Yeah.
That's great. I know there were a few other people
Yes.
And there was one lady who was in her 70s. She died a couple of years ago. We mentioned that. There aren't too many of these.
You think about bed sores and all kinds of other things that are just remaining in one position.
It's hard.
It's so sad.
Well, to him, it's not sad. He's living.
Still alive.
He's doing things.
Yeah, I know, but.
So you got to adjust. Dickson, what do you have for us?
Well, I have something about rivers this time, and it's behind a paywall, unfortunately, because it's in Science Magazine. But they just published an article, not in this week's issue, but in last week's issue, of a Landsat 8 composite calculation of the land mass volume of rivers. That is, how much of the land do the rivers take up?
Mm-hmm.
All right. And the last time they had a figure on this, which I thought was fairly accurate, they listed this number, something like 500,000 square kilometers. And that's not the actual figure. The real figure is 770,000 kilometers. They were off by 40% of the actual volume of the Earth dedicated to rivers. And so they then made speculation in this article about the role of rivers in climate change. And it's their ability to absorb and process greenhouse gases and this sort of thing, which was, of course, totally underestimated because they just didn't know how much volume they were talking about. So it's a wonderful article because you can actually zone in on the tributary of a river through these Landsat photographs that they've listed for you. So I was very impressed with
What fraction of the Earth is ocean?
Oh, that's 3/4 of the
75%?
world. 75%? Yeah, but that's where all the water ends up from these rivers, right? Well, almost all of them, at least. So I was fascinated by this because of the power of remote sensing.
Now, the origin of all these rivers is snow?
Or glaciers or rain. No, certainly not rain, but sometimes springs come from the aquifers.
Yeah, okay.
But mostly it's mountains.
Kathy, what do you have for us?
I picked TWiV 181. So I don't often listen to TWiV, but I happened to pick this one. And it is with the one that you had with John Warhol. And the title is Dr. Warhol's Periodic Table of Microbes. And it was a totally engaging episode. I liked three things about it. First of all, his career was as a medical writer, a scientific writer. Is that what they're called? Medical communications.
Yeah.
And it's the same kind of career that my former student, Tien, has in New York City. And I hadn't really heard about it until her. And then I've talked to a couple other people who do it. But it was a nice way to learn about an alternative career, I thought, for people. And then I can't remember what the order was now because it was about 2 weeks ago that I listened to it. But he's put together a periodic table of the microbes, and he's written a book about it. And it's just terrific. And he also has one of viruses. And so I wrote to him, and we're now communicating. And I'm going to get the virus one and the bacteria one. And so it's really cool. And then he's got this quest to make an official New Jersey state microbe. And so there are different microbes for different states already. Like Wisconsin has a Lactococcus lactis, Hawaii has one, Oregon has one, which is yeast. And what John Warhol is pushing for New Jersey is Streptomyces griseus. And so it's moving along. Let's see, on June 14th, it was unanimously approved by the New Jersey Senate State Government Committee, and then it was approved in late July by the full New Jersey Senate.
Is that because of Waxman's discovery?
Sure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So anyway, it's just a really cool episode, and I think people who mostly listen to TWiV might enjoy listening to this particular TWiV.
Yeah, I
did.
It. It was fun.
Great.
Yeah, I heard him at a talk I went to a meeting in Seton Hall in the spring, and he gave a talk about all this stuff. And I said, "Hey, you have to come on TWiV." And then he was in Atlanta for ASM, so I cornered him for an hour and talked to him. Yeah, he's an interesting guy. So he said he is related to Andy Warhol.
Mm-hmm.
There's a crossover between art and science.
He never met him.
Yeah. Yeah. So check out these periodic tables, at least the one of bacteria, and then I'll let you know when I get my virus one up. I'm going to put it up on the wall too.
Cool.
All right, mine is an article in the American Journal of Public Health. It's entitled "Weaponized Health Communication, Twitter Bots and Russian Trolls Amplify the Vaccine Debate." So this was a study they did from July 2014 through September 2017. They wanted to look at Twitter bots and trolls. You know, bots are computers that generate messages, and trolls are people that say things to
live under bridges
to get you excited, to get you angry.
Right.
And they went through something like something over 1 million tweets and analyzed them in a variety of ways for certain keywords and so forth. And one of them was the hashtag #VaccinateUS, which is a hashtag designed to promote discord using vaccination as a political wedge. These tweets were uniquely identified with Russian troll accounts linked to the Internet Research Agency, which, of course, is the company which is backed by the Russian government and which, was playing with Facebook in the 2016 election. Anyway, compared with average users, Russian trolls and bots and content polluters tweeted about vaccination at higher rates. And so they're basically participating and being divisive in the anti-vaccine debate. So if someone says something about a vaccine, they'll immediately go in and say, yeah, vaccines are bad for this reason or that reason. Bots spread malware and unsolicited content, disseminate anti-vaccine messages, and trolls promote discord. Accounts masquerading as legitimate users create false equivalency, eroding public consensus on vaccination. So the conclusion is, what are we going to do? We got to figure out how to combat this so basically, if you're online and you find a lot of anti-vax information online, but even on social media, not all of the anti-vaccine sentiment is real. It is a bot or a troll. Mm-hmm. And they're Russian, and they're just trying to sow discord and ruin this country's structure, essentially, in multiple ways, not just by influencing elections. They're clearly trying to influence elections. If you think they're not, you're just ignoring the facts. It's not a partisan issue, folks. It's true. And now they're doing it as well by disseminating discord about vaccines.
Putin said he didn't do it, though, Vincent. Don't you believe him?
No, I don't believe it.
I see.
We have an intelligence community for decades and many, many years has had issues with the Soviet Union and now Russia. And just because a president says that it ain't true, I don't believe it. I'm sorry. I believe carefully collected information. Anyway, it's an interesting article which has gotten a lot of press this week as it was released. All right, so that'll do it for TWiV 508. You can find it at Apple Podcasts, microbe.tv/TWiV. Send your questions and comments to TWiV at microbe.tv. And if you'd like to support us, go over to microbe.tv/contribute. We have a number of ways that we can do that. And I want to thank Jolene Ramsey, who has been doing the timestamps for TWiV.
Oh, I wondered who it was. Thanks, Jolene. Yeah. That's great. I've been using it.
Yeah, so Jennifer Hamilton defended, and she had stopped doing them. And then Jolene, who, of course, had Kathy and I at Indiana University last November for a TWiV and a TWIM, and then had us at Texas A&M for a TWiV with everyone but Dickson. You were in Washington at the time.
And pillows and other swag.
She made pillows. Her mom made us phage pillows. And we had a great
I'm
time.
Looking at Vincent's now. It's lovely, actually.
And afterwards in the reception, she said, what can I do? And I said, well, can I do timestamps? I said, yes, sure, if you want to. But you should probably do other things as well. So we're going to get her more involved. She's very happy to do it. And then more people. So thank you, Jolene. That's great. Dickson Despommier is at thelivingriver.org and Despommier.photoart.com.
Thank you for that plug.
Despommier Photo Art has lovely photographs taken by Dickson of
things.
Streams, right?
No,
it's Despommier. Oh, that's right. Despommier Photo. Thelivingriver.org is the fishing thing. That's right. Despommier Photo Art is other
portraits, landscapes, animals.
This morning, Dickson showed me photographs of his watercolors, about 100 of them. And he's really got talent.
Oh, stop. Oh, shucks.
I knew that.
Well, Dickson, if you listen to what I said, you get mad at me because it assumes that I didn't think you had talent before.
That's not true at all.
You had other talents, but you have an artistic talent. It's lovely. Very nice watercolors of all sorts.
Kind of.
And he's planning to put them online, right? So that everyone can see them.
Not everyone. I would like
do you have somebody to help you do that?
I hope you will.
No problem. Thank you, Dickson.
You're welcome.
Kathy Spindler's at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Thank you, Kathy.
Thanks. This is a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
Rich Condit is an emeritus professor at the University of Florida, Gainesville. He's currently residing in Austin, Texas. Thank you, Rich.
Sure enough. Always a good time.
Our guest has been Jens Kuhn from the Integrated Research Facility in Fort Detrick. Thank you, Jens.
What's the acronym for that?
The IRF.
IRF.
Uh-huh.
Careful how you say that.
Really good, Jens. Great stories.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just didn't know that you had done that, so this is great. And we will get you back to talk about some of the related things that we didn't talk about.
Yeah, that will be fun.
Thanks very much. I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at virology.ws. Thanks to ASM for their support and Ronald Jenkins for his music. You've been listening to This Week in Virology. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week. Another TWiV is viral.